So welcome everybody. We are so excited to have you in class today. Today's class is looking at slavery in America. And my name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer here at the National Constitution Center. And I'm really excited about it because I'm actually here at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. We thought today's topic is such an amazing topic. We wanted to bring you the people's voices, and we have a great exhibit at the National Constitution Center about the Civil War and Reconstruction, and it's filled with primary source artifacts that are from the time periods and really can help us tell this story even better than we normally do. So of course, we're here with our top scholar from the Constitution Center. Jeff, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. How exciting to be able to share this exhibit with you. And I think that we should just get started. Curry is standing in front of Dred and Harriet Scott. And that's a great place to begin our conversation today, because it was the Dred Scott case that helped to crystallize the need to change the original Constitution to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence. The story we're about to hear together is how the promise of the Declaration, that all human beings are created equal, was thwarted in the original Constitution by the compromises over slavery, resurrected by Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, fought for by heroes like Dred and Harriet Scott, like Frederick Douglass, like John Bingham, enshrined in the Constitution in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, thwarted again by the Supreme Court after the Civil War, and then the exhibit ends with Martin Luther King on the Mall in Washington saying that he has a dream that the promise of the Declaration will be resurrected. So Dred and Harriet Scott, Curry, is that still Dred's freedom petition behind you? We had the original at some point, and I think this may be a reproduction because we had to give it back, but it's let's zero in on it.
Yeah, so it's right here in the case. So this exhibit really sets up the building to crisis. So looking closely at the structural and original Constitution. And Jeff, I'd love for you to kind of look through kind of the three big pieces that we find slavery not mentioned by name, but put into the structural Constitution. And then we get to look at these amazing, what we refer to as our freedom seekers, or who they really were freedom fighters. So this petition right here is Harriet Scott Petition for Freedom from 1846. And as Dave, who is my awesome cameraman with me today, zooms in, you can look at this document. We are lucky enough, Jeff, to let you know that it is actually the real document today.
Wow.
This is the original one. I know. I was like even more excited.
And this is Harriet Scott's freedom petition?
What was that?
It's Harriet Scott's freedom petition, because we began with Dred Scott last year, but I don't think that I've seen Harriet Scott's petition since it's arrived. That is amazing. Friends, doesn't that give you the chills to see the original words? Curry, tell us more about the document. Can you read what she's saying? And is it written by her or by her lawyer? Tell us about it.
A great question. So we remember that we begin with Harriet as an enslaved person. She's also an enslaved mother, and she is brought to Missouri with her husband, Dred Scott, and they have two daughters. And so as the fear begins to loom that they may be brought back to a non-free state and they are freedom, they begin to fight for that freedom. And Harriet works with, so Harriet Scott signed this, it's a petition. And remember how important petition is for so many people that do not have the power and the rights of all the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. That petition is something that people can use to hear their voice heard. So what I find so fascinating about this is when you look at this petition, it begins with Harriet. She's the first to say, this is not okay. I do not want my daughters to go back into enslavement. And I am going to work with abolitionists to fight for my freedom. Dred Scott comes in next. The court case is actually heard through his name as Dred Scott. But when you look at this petition very close at the end, you see that Harriet makes an X for her name. So Jeff, I was wondering if you could share with our students why Harriet makes an X. Why isn't she allowed to be able to write her full name? Why doesn't she know how?
Well, she was probably not allowed to learn how to read or write because the laws forbade teaching enslaved people how to read or write. Because, I mean, just really, it's such a violation of
Dignity.
of humanity, of our natural rights to the exercise of our conscience and free speech. Can you imagine the degrading, inhuman laws that would make it a crime to teach people how to write? Anyway, that's why Harriet had to sign with an X. Dred Scott's freedom petition was also signed with an X. But both of them believed correctly that they were entitled to the same natural rights that all human beings are entitled to. And that's why they petitioned the court. And that's what makes the court case so agonizing. So thanks for pulling back. Is it who's running the camera? Is it Dave?
Dave's with us, yes.
Dave, great, thank you, Dave. Yeah, so there's Harriet and Dave Scott. And can you pan up a little bit to the quotation from Chief Justice Taney, just above them? Chief Justice Taney, there we go. African Americans have no rights which the white man is bound to respect. Chief Justice Roger Taney, the 1857 Dred Scott case. We talked about it a little bit on Monday in class. Remember, it's a complicated case, but the gist of it, as Curry said, is both Dred and Harriet Scott claimed that when Dred Scott's master took him to free territory in Fort Snelling, he should have been freed because his status as an enslaved person was determined by the place of his residence. Now, the court rejected that claim. It could have rejected it narrowly. It could have just said, no, his status is determined by the place of his domicile, and therefore the fact that he traveled to free territory doesn't free him. But Chief Justice Taney went much further than that in saying African Americans have no rights which white men are bound to respect. He suggested that even free African Americans were not entitled to the rights of the Constitution, of free speech, of being able to be taught to read and write, of the right to make contracts, to sue and be sued. He suggested that because we, the people at the original Constitution, were just white people, therefore African Americans were in a separate and degraded state and could have no rights of American citizenship. Friends, that claim was outrageously false as a matter of original understanding, because as we talked about, great, Dave, let's see Lincoln and kind of,
Yeah, we're going to go to Lincoln in 1 second, but keep going and tell.
Perfect. Frederick Douglass's inkwell. My gosh, what more inspiring artifact to see. So Frederick Douglass, the great hero of freedom, in the 1840s is reading Madison's notes on the Constitution, and which are published for the first time. And he learns that Madison declared that the Constitution meant to take no position on whether there could be property in men, that it refused to say that there could be property in men. Douglass said that when he read those words, it changed his own conception of himself, and as a man and as a citizen, he abandoned his previous view that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, as the Garrisonians, after William Lloyd Garrison, had held, and instead believed that it was an anti-slavery document that studiously protected the rights of all. And it was with that pen that we just saw on his writing desk that he wrote some of the most galvanizing statements about the pro-freedom inclinations of the Constitution, including the unforgettable speech, "What to a slave is the 4th of July." So we now see how important it is to the Dred Scott decision, rallying people from Frederick Douglass to Abraham Lincoln to efface its stain and to write its calumnies out of the Constitution. So now Curry is standing in front of an incredibly moving portrait of Abraham Lincoln, painted by an African-American artist who is so inspired by Lincoln that he painted him every year during the last years of his life. And then let's pan just to my left and see Lincoln's hands and the flag. There's also here this, look at that. Those are Lincoln's hands. He, at the Republican nomination of 1857, he shook so many hands that his hands were swollen and he had to clutch a broomstick in order to stop them from shaking. And then next to his hands are a plate of the flag being raised over Independence Hall in 1861. And you don't have to pan back, Dave, but you can see the full print behind you. And in 1861, the great, wonderful, there's the flag itself, the actual fragments of the flag. Imagine, friends, that we are standing in front of Independence Hall with Lincoln. Just gives you the chills, doesn't it? In 1861, and Lincoln is there, and he says, "I have never had a thought politically that didn't stem from the Declaration of Independence." And then he said, "I would rather be assassinated on this spot than abandon the principles of the Declaration of Independence." Just extraordinarily powerful. That's how fervently Lincoln believed that Jefferson's promise that all persons are all men are created equal, was a promise that had to be vindicated by the Constitution. And that's why Lincoln begins by fighting the Civil War to preserve the Union, and he comes to believe that the war must be fought to end slavery. Now, Kerry, do you want to take us around?
Yeah, I was going to kind of bring our students up to this point. So if you use this in your head like a timeline, we have the Constitutional Convention in 1787 sets up the Constitution. And then we have these abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, like William Lloyd Garrison, like John Brown, like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, fighting for freedom and breaking the bonds that they're in to push more and more. We move on to Lincoln, and at this point in time, we move into the Civil War. So the Civil War erupts, the secession from the southern states, and we will do a quick kind of glance by that document in a second. And then we're going to stop for 1 second at the Emancipation Proclamation and think about how Lincoln used his powers during wartime to free enslaved people where he could, but then really focus the second half of this experience on the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. So I wanted to lay that out as we go through these next pieces. So we'll kind of move towards the Emancipation Proclamation. This copy that you're about to see is the actual copy that was sold in Philadelphia during a sanitary fair. It was sold to raise funds for all of the soldiers and dying in camp, because the camps were so dirty and diseased. And so Lincoln felt very close to all of the young men in these camps and did anything he possibly could to help support them and raise public and private funds. I think one of my fascinating things that when we first got this document here at the Constitution Center that we were told was very rarely did he sign his full signature to a non-government document, a non-legal document. But because this mattered so much to help and protect the soldiers fighting for freedom, he signed his full name. This was auctioned off in Philadelphia and raised funds. But also Lincoln was so unbelievably close to this war, not just for the freedom that it was fighting, but also this is the beginning of the telegraph. This is the beginning of how he can get direct information, real time, into his small telegraph cabin and finding exactly not just the wins, but the death toll that's happening at the war for this great freedom. And there's amazing stories about African Americans leaving their enslavement and running to the Union troops and saying, I will fight for my freedom. So Jeff, could you give us a little bit more about the Emancipation Proclamation and the War Powers Act that it was?
I will do all that. I just want to say you look great to me, Kerry, but a bunch of folks are saying we need to set up Zoom on gallery view, not speaker view to see us both. So maybe just check with Dave to make sure we're good on that. But yeah. And then Victoria, you're asking, is it on loan to the NCC or is it permanent? It is a loan, but it's a permanent loan by one of our great friends. It's owned by Stephen Galbraith, and he's generously loaned it to us for a long-term loan. So the thing to know about this amazing Emancipation Proclamation, and we talked about this in Monday on class, Lincoln is such a good lawyer. He believes that he only has the authority as commander-in-chief to free enslaved people in either territories in rebellion that are under federal military control or states that are in rebellion. But for loyal states that have slavery, including the District of Columbia and other states that are not in rebellion, he thinks he has no power to end slavery. So that's why the 13th Amendment for him is necessary to end slavery throughout the entire United States. And the Emancipation Proclamation as a military proclamation has more limited effect. Kerry, as you see, is saying, if you pick gallery view, you can see us both. I mentioned that the war began as a fight to preserve the Union for Lincoln and then was transformed for him into a fight to end slavery. Let's just take a beat on why Lincoln thought that the Union was indissoluble. Remember when we talked about the preamble to the Constitution, we talked about James Wilson, who wrote it, and his belief that we, the people of the United States as a whole, are sovereign or have the ultimate authority. And because the whole people made the Constitution, the whole people had to agree before it could be changed. Lincoln, channeling Wilson, believed that when South Carolina and Virginia and other states seceded from the Union, and we have their secession telegrams behind this Emancipation Proclamation, they couldn't do that. They had no power to do that because having joined the Union, they would need the consent of the entire people to leave it. It took the Civil War itself, the bloodiest in American history, 23,000 dead or wounded at Gettysburg, at Antietam, to establish the proposition that we, the people of the United States, are sovereign. And that's why today, if South Carolina or Texas or California or New York were to claim to try to secede, they couldn't do that because the Civil War established that we, the people of the United States as a whole, are sovereign. We were just walking past a carpet bag. The carpetbaggers from the North went to the South after the Civil War to try to establish rights. And we also have Charles Sumner's remarkable statement to the left: equality of rights is the first of rights. Sumner, the great abolitionist, determined to inscribe into the Constitution the promise of equality. Sumner, caned on the floor of the Senate by a Southern senator who opposed abolitionism, almost beaten to death. That's how violent things were. We think we have problems today, friends, with our extremely acrimonious politics. In those days, people would run for Congress on the grounds, my left hook is better than the other guy, I'm going to beat him up. And Sumner almost died from the attack with this cane. But nevertheless, he insisted that equality had to be enshrined in the Constitution. He wrote the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which promised equal accommodations to all. And on his deathbed, he cried, my bill, don't let them forget my bill. And then he expired. It's incredibly dramatic. Okay, so 13th Amendment. Kerry, I'll start in a second, but why don't you set it up and tell us about it?
Perfect. So hi, everybody. Again, make sure if you want to click on gallery view, you'll be able to see both of us. So I'm standing in front of a giant 13. I'm not sure if you can see that, but I am also, more importantly, standing in front of a copy of one of the original 13th Amendment copies of the government. So what does the 13th Amendment do? And Jeff, if you want to screen share the interactive Constitution at this point, perfect timing. The 13th Amendment ends slavery. And I'd love to be able to read the words exactly to you, because we really look at these words and we say the 13th Amendment ends slavery, and involuntary servitude are the words that we really dig into. But then there's two other pieces to it. Number one is what we talk about as being the loophole to the 13th Amendment. And if you want to kind of look at that closely, you can look at when can you be forced to work without being compensated? And I'll let you guys answer that in the chat. So in our country, when can you be forced to work without being compensated? And people that wrote this amendment said that this was a worry that they had to it. The other thing that the 13th Amendment does is the Section 2. It gives more power to Congress. It says, Congress, you have more power to be able to enforce this. It's the enforcement clause. And I point that out now because you're going to see that enforcement clause in 13, in 14, and in 15. And this is why some historians say that the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, changed the original Constitution, and it really makes it a second founding. That's up to you to decide if you think it was that big of a change in our Constitution to make it a second founding, like the Constitutional Convention was the first founding. But let's dive a little bit deeper into the 13th Amendment. And I can see Jeff has the drafting table up. This is a great free resource that you'll see in the chat in a second. And you can really dig into the players and the writers and the drafts of the 13th Amendment. Jeff, to you.
That was great, Kerry. And at the exhibit, you can use the drafting table on touchscreens, but you guys can just check it out online. So as Kerry said, the criminal exception provision was incredibly big loophole. And it was taken from the Northwest Ordinance, which allowed convict leasing, this provision of forced labor as a punishment for some crimes. Let's look at the way that it first expressed itself. Except in punishment of a crime was where the party is duly convicted is the December 13 draft. And then we accept as punishment for a crime. So the language remains the same because it's taken from the Northwest Ordinance, but except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So we know exactly where the language came from. Why was this so troubling and infamous? Because as soon as it passed, Southern states began to create lots of punishment for minor crimes, and they used this to reimpose slavery by another mean. So for example, if you insulted a white person, you could be convicted of a misdemeanor and sentenced to 10 years of penal servitude of convict leasing in order to work off your supposed offense. Or if you were guilty of other low-level crimes, you basically could be essentially locked up for years. Then something else really infamous happened. The southern states passed a series of so-called black codes, and we can start panning over to the 14th Amendment now. These black codes denied African Americans the right to, yeah, exactly. They're the
Sorry.
actual black
I'm making you,
codes.
I should have warned everybody, bring your Dramamine today.
No, well, only you, Kerry, because you got to keep moving, but we're enjoying this view so much, although not the content, because this infamous black code would deny African Americans the right to sue or be sued, to make or enforce contracts, to inherit property, and basically to have all the civil rights that white people did. So we fought the Civil War, and no sooner is it fought than all these southern states are passing these laws which basically deny equal rights to African Americans. So what happens next? Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866. That right guarantees to all persons, white and African American, the same rights, the same civil rights to make and enforce contracts, to sue and be sued throughout the United States. And that's the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Great job, Dave, in showing us all of this. Andrew Johnson vetoes the Civil Rights Act. Congress repasses the law over his veto by a 2/3 majority. But then there's a serious debate. Does Congress have the power to pass the Civil Rights Act? And some say, yes, Congress can do it on its own. And don't worry, we'll have a majority in Congress forever, so you don't have to pass a constitutional amendment. Others, like Thaddeus Stevens and John Bingham, say, no, better safe than sorry. Let's enshrine in the Constitution and make it clear that Congress has the power to pass the Civil Rights Act so that future generations can't question it. And that's what leads to the 14th Amendment, which we're about to look at now. There's so much to talk about the 14th Amendment, and we'll screen share it in a second, but Kerry, why don't you introduce it?
And we have 6 minutes. So 14th Amendment is huge. So we're standing in front of a copy of the 14th Amendment, and I'm going to read for you the words here that are so unbelievably important. And they're by George Downing. And this is, I won't tell you the year, I'll tell you the year at the end. We are Americans, native-born Americans. We are citizens. We see no recognition of color or race in the organic law of the land. This is George Downing in 1866. There are African Americans meeting, assembling, and asking and calling for rights. They are looking at the Declaration of Independence. They're looking at the Constitution, and they're saying, we see the law. We see equality before the law. We just need it applied to us as well. And this really tees up what the 14th Amendment is. Jeff, dive us into the 14th Amendment, because this is an amendment, I like to say, it keeps on giving. It has a lot in there, so much to unpack. But really, what's the big takeaway of what the 14th Amendment does for our country and how it changes equality and freedom in America?
Well, the big takeaway is that Congress has the power to guarantee everyone equal civil rights. The last section, Section 5, says Congress shall have the power to enforce this by appropriate legislation. Section 1, which is where all of the action today is, says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. That overturns the Dred Scott decision, which said that African Americans could never be citizens of the United States. So this makes citizenship national and ensures birthright citizenship. It then says no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Privileges or immunities is a synonym for civil rights. That means that everyone has equal civil rights or privileges or immunities, and no states can enforce it. That was the dream of James Madison, that there were certain civil rights that the states as well as the federal government couldn't infringe. Finally, it is enshrined in the Constitution. Then it says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Note the difference between persons who are guaranteed life, liberty, or property, as well as the equal protection of the law, and citizens who have privileges or immunities. That suggests there are certain rights that citizens have that non-citizens don't have. But it also suggests that certain rights, like equal protection, are guaranteed to all persons, citizens and non-citizens alike. Now, there's so much more to say about all of these words. We will talk more about the 14th Amendment next week, but it's just a thrill to see them here. And if you want to look at the early drafts of the 14th Amendment, which would have guaranteed political rights like voting rights as well as civil rights, you can look at them in the drafting table. But for now, we need to go look, and we're going to conclude here at the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed African Americans the equal political rights or voting rights that the 14th Amendment did not.
So I'm standing in front of two ballot boxes. This ballot box was used by African American men in 1867. And this ballot box, some southern states before the 15th Amendment are being forced to ensure that African American men can vote. Beside me on this side is a ballot box from the 1800s. The reason that I point this out is because this is when we start to see now an interracial democracy in America taking hold. And we see some of our first African-American men holding political office at almost every single level. We've got amazing people like Hiram Revels, who's a first African-American senator. We've got Smalls, we've got Bassett, we've got Blanche Bruce. I'm sorry, I always say his name backwards. These amazing men that take office in the levels of sheriff all the way to senator. And we see tens of thousands of African-American men in all across the country. And we see this even more supported when the 15th Amendment comes out. And just as a side note, because I know we're going to wrap up in a minute, we also have an amazing, amazing video that is right around the corner from me with Martin Luther King speaking. And what I really want to dive into is we want to talk about the year that the 15th Amendment was ratified. We also want to look at the backlash that happens after that and the needed work of civil rights leaders through 1940s, 1950s, and the 1960s with Martin Luther King and John Lewis. So connecting those dots and realizing that, yes, that arc of freedom does bend towards justice, but if you look at the graph, it's a little bit more zigzaggy along the way, and it takes a constant movement and a constant pressure to bend it towards justice. So Jeff, can you break down the 15th Amendment for our students so they can dive into what year and the goal of the 15th Amendment?
Absolutely, and that was beautifully said, Kerry. Thank you for introducing that so well. And just let's go back to that green ballot box just for one more sec. It's so moving. If you look on the back of it, it's a cereal box. It was a breakfast cereal. And it was the first time African Americans ever cast a right to vote in Virginia. It just gives you the chills to see it. It was a humble box, but they wanted to dignify it by putting this, green covering over what was a cereal box. You compare it with the fancy box for white people next to it. And it shows you why it was that Frederick Douglass believed that the right to vote was the most important right that the Civil War could guarantee. With the right to vote, he believed African Americans could protect rights and their rights would be secure. The tragedy of the 15th Amendment is that it was so narrow in its protections. First of all, it didn't include women, white or African American women. It only included African American men. The next thing that it didn't do, and you can see this on the drafting table, is it formally guaranteed the right of access to the ballot, but it did not prevent southern states and some northern states too from passing literacy tests that forced you to show that you knew how to read before you could cast a right to vote and were administered in a discriminatory way. Poll taxes. Poll means not showing up at the polls, but a head tax that everyone who showed up had to pay based on, the tax for every head or person, and made it impossible for poor people to vote. And other discriminatory ruses that basically deprive African Americans of the right to vote as soon as they're granted it. It's just a terrible tragedy. And if you look in the drafting table, you'll see that some earlier versions of the 15th Amendment would have guaranteed protection against poll taxes and literacy tests. Look at Representative Wilson on February 7th, 1869. No discrimination shall be made in the exercise of the elective franchise or the right to hold office, not just the right to vote, but the right to hold office on account of race, color, nativity, property, education, or creed. If those provisions had passed, you couldn't have poll taxes, which discriminated on the basis of property. You couldn't have literacy tests, which discriminated on the basis of education. And you couldn't have discrimination on the basis of creed or religious tests. But that didn't pass. And the final version that actually did pass said the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race. Now that was something, but it was immediately thwarted by, oh my gosh, Kerry, there you are standing in front of that chilling robe, the Ku Klux Klan. Tell our friends what that robe is, and then I'll wrap up.
So this is a reproduction of an early Klan costume, uniform, what I'm trying to think of the exact right word. When I remember when we first opened the exhibit and I looked at this, I was completely confused because this in my head was not the visual that I had stuck in my head about what a Klan costume looked like. Now, a Klan member is a terrorist organization that is hateful towards African-American people, towards people of many, many minorities, and they would use the violence to suppress the vote, to suppress the voice, and to suppress freedoms. So when we talk about, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, there's that additional clause in each one to say Congress is given the power to enforce it. The men who wrote these amendments knew that this would be a difficult battle. And it does take Congress almost 100 years to begin to really, really engage over and over about changing this. But that does not stop the violence towards people, but it also does not stop the people for fighting for their freedoms in the most dangerous and most terrorizing ways. Now, when you look at this piece of material, it may not look like what you think of from the 1920s movies around the Klan. And this is one of the original ones, what it looked like. And so it looked very ornate. It looked very detailed. And that, I think, was in so many ways the secondary awfulness of it, that somebody sat down and made this with care to do such violence towards others. When I do not want to end on this tragic moment, because there are so many amazing moments and so many people that through all the barriers, all the violence, and all the constant intimidation over and over and over again fought for freedoms that they would never see, but maybe generations from them they would see. I do want to just say that this week we did lose who I lovingly refer to as Ruby Bridges' mom, Lucille Bridges, and she was one of these freedom fighters. But also in this exhibit, it's my favorite way to end this is to look at the second civil rights movement in America. The first civil rights movement begins with people like Octavius Catto in Philadelphia fighting for the right to vote. It moves on to people like Hiram Revels and pushing to vote. But then we look at the next kind of 100 years later, the second major civil rights movement in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, where people have fought, people died for their freedom. So I'd like to end you on that view.
Wow, French, just look at that for a sec, because it's going to really something. Let's just wait for Dr. King. Here's Lyndon Johnson. Signing the Civil Rights Act. And there's the mall. March on Washington, John Lewis, Dr. King, Raymond Randolph. Wow, look at all those folks.
One day, this nation will rise up, live up to the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
Wow, isn't that incredible, friends? King, resurrecting Jefferson's words, shining with such promise at the founding, thwarted by that original Constitution, reinvoked by Lincoln at Gettysburg, but it took that march and Dr. King's vision to begin to make it a reality in the Civil Rights Act. The struggle continues, the constitutional debates continue, but we are so grateful to you for joining us. Kerry, what a phenomenal idea to show our friends around the exhibit. And There's just so much to learn and so much more to say. We'll talk more about the 14th Amendment next week. I think we've got to show them the 19th Amendment too, because it's
I
right
know
behind it.
that's coming up in a few weeks, and
I
we
know.
will absolutely walk you through the other amazing exhibit, my other favorite exhibit, the
Yeah.
19th Amendment. I want to thank you all for joining us today. We will hang out after this and answer some of the questions we weren't able to during the class. But I was listening to Annette Gordon-Reed this week speaking about history, and when we walk through this exhibit, we get so moved by these unbelievable stories of people fighting for freedom, but also so moved by the tragic events. And what Annette Gordon-Reed said, she's like, you look at history and you look at people of the past and you say, how has this changed for us? And what is the legacy of that moment? And when we think about legacy, I don't think there's any better way to end it than on somebody like Martin Luther King, like John Lewis, like Rosa Parks, like Ruby Bridges. And so we want to thank you so much for joining us today. If you ever get to Philadelphia, we want to welcome you in this exhibit. Please let us know. We'd love to meet you while you're here. But if not, we can bring the exhibits to you through our virtual tours whenever you like. So let us know. There's a link in the chat and an email in the chat. But we are here to really engage you with all we have at the National Constitution Center. Me, Jeff, our scholars, and our exhibits. And we are really grateful to our fantastic camera guy today, who I have tortured, Dave Stotts. So thank you guys very much. And we will wrap up. Jeff, any final words? And then we will answer questions.
No, bravo to you, Curry. Beautiful job. I'm so glad we could share this with you, friends. I can tell from your comments, you're as moved as we are. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Thank you so much. God bless.
Thank you, guys. See you next time in class.
Bye.
Okay, everybody, we'll follow up any questions. Please let us know. I am here. I'm just hiding under the cameras to be able to read it.
One day, this nation will rise up, live up to the meaning of its creed. Behold, these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created.
David, great question. So the question in the chat right now, and I'm sorry you can't see me while I talk, was the Dred Scott decision popular or unpopular with the bulk of Northern whites at the time? Very unpopular. Lincoln. So we have this great video that we're going to release in the next couple of weeks from Justice Gorsuch speaking about the Dred Scott decision. And what he says is that Taney overstepped his bounds of the Supreme Court and tried to write law. It wasn't right to begin with, and then overstepped his bounds, and it wasn't even his job. It was a very unpopular view. And what Lincoln said was, that's not your job. That's not what you're allowed to do. So we are not going to enforce it in the way that you want. So what Taney was thinking in his head was, first of all, he believed what he wrote, that African Americans were not citizens, but he thought he was going to end this kind of quell towards the Civil War and say, I'll fix it. I know what, I'm going to end this now. But what he did was he wrote into the Constitution those words, and Lincoln had to begin with the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Reconstructing founders had to end that and stop that by fixing the Constitution with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So it was very unpopular by many Northerns, but not all. Remember that these issues aren't just a North-South issue, that when we look at these embedded systematic pieces of racism, we're seeing it north to south, east to west. So we have to think about this as, where is the structural issue, and then where are the issues connected to these sections of the country as well? So great question. Yeah. Sorry, National Constitution Center, yes. Yeah, so Adele, I'm sorry about that. We did have a little glitch with Zoom today. Zoom wouldn't let me pin the exhibit. So I apologize for that, but I will fix that, Adele, next time. And I always appreciate your feedback. It's helpful. Thank you. Great question. So how did Jim Crow and the 14th Amendment exist? Slaughterhouse case. That's one way to look at it. So what were the rollbacks and the lack of action by the Congress? By Congress not taking action, by the pushback on the 14th Amendment with the slaughterhouse case. That's how you get Jim Crow existing at the same time as the 14th Amendment. That's why you have to wait until these greats force Congress and the courts to take up the charge that they were given during the Reconstruction time period. Great. Thank you, guys. I'm going to wrap now. We thank you so much for joining us. Please feel free to let us know any more questions that you have, and we can give you the links to different parts of the exhibit. But thank you so much, and we'll see you next week in class, gang. Thank you. Bye.